The mob is coming for a dissident professor near you, as academic cancel culture heats up. Last June, in the racially charged days following the death of George Floyd, psychology professor Charles Negy of the University of Central Florida triggered his excommunication by tweeting, "Black privilege is real." He explained, quote, "Besides affirmative action, special scholarships, and other set-asides, being shielded from legitimate criticism is a privilege. But as a group, they're missing out on much-needed feedback," end quote. It wasn't unreasonable, and it certainly wasn't hate. But it was the beginning of the end for the tenured prof who had dared to break consensus on Black American victimhood. Almost immediately, #UCFFireHim began trending on Twitter. A ragtag group of protesters gathered on Negy's campus, and a full-on mobbing had begun. Academia has become ground zero for this typically feminine form of relational aggression, which seeks, as a recent article in Ariel magazine put it, quote, "reputation destruction and social exclusion," end quote. Negy's MO was, in contrast, typically masculine, intended not to shame and exclude, but to confront and argue rationally. Another Negy tweet from the same time reads like exasperated but well-intentioned practical advice about how to defeat alleged oppression through common-sense measures like staying in school and avoiding gangs and drugs. The woke mob, however, doesn't care about intentions or common sense. It cares only that you have failed to offer your allegiance, failed to join the 2 minutes hate, in this case, failed to affirm white privilege and anti-Black racism as mandated by critical race orthodoxy. From the mob's perspective, the refusal of allegiance makes the dissident abhorrent, contemptible, without redeeming qualities, and deserving only of social and professional elimination. Canadian sociologist Kenneth Westhuse has made the study of mobbing his life's work. He has demonstrated the remarkable viciousness of many otherwise conscientious, decent people who have ardently participated in destroying their colleagues' lives without compunction, convinced that their victim deserves nothing else. Amidst the firestorm around Negy, his school, the University of Central Florida, predictably failed to support him and, even worse, openly sided with the mob, condemning his rather mild if provocative tweets as racist and, quote, completely counter to UCF's values, end quote, while admitting that a tenured prof couldn't be fired for constitutionally protected speech. University personnel set out to find a rationale to purge him. They requested that any students with complaints about Negy should come forward, and not surprisingly, students came forward in droves with various stories of offense, mostly having to do with statements Negy allegedly made either in the classroom or in private conversations, some of the alleged statements dating back years. All of them, of course, distorted through recontextualization in the witch hunt atmosphere of accusation and moral grandstanding. In a sane world, such thin gruel wouldn't even have whetted the appetite of a disciplinary body with better things to do than spend dozens of hours listening to hearsay. But in woke 2020, it was more than sufficient for an administration falling all over itself to prove its social justice credentials, and according to news reports, the university fired Negy in late January for academic misconduct, having produced a 244-page report on the equal opportunity offenders' various transgressions, which ranged from telling students that God wasn't real to informing them that all men were a little bit gay, and that penis size varied with race. For those of us following what has come to be called cancel culture at North American universities, the sheer number and variety of professors hounded for politically incorrect statements or alleged harassment is now well past reckoning. From the well-known to the relatively obscure, from Yale's Nicholas Christakis and Evergreen's Brett Weinstein to NYU's Michael Rechtenwald and New Brunswick's Ricardo Duchenne, reported cases now come too thick and fast to track. At Studio Brûlé, we've covered a large number of profs who have run afoul of the intersectional thought police, including but not limited to Larry Summers, Sir Timothy Hunt, Jordan Peterson, of course, Alan Franson, Rick Mehta, Paul Griffiths, Francesco Ayala, Rebecca Tuvel, Dennis Gauss, Alessandro Strumia, Rachel Fulton Brown, and Mark Selinsky, and they're the proverbial tip of the iceberg. The real number of the persecuted will never be known. Many professors, having been shamed and bullied past endurance and finding no support amongst their colleagues, allow themselves to be quietly terminated, preferring their names be kept out of the public domain in hopes of retaining some shred of dignity or possibility of starting their lives again. And not all professors are fired. Some are made so uncomfortable that they choose to leave their universities. A few fight and win a Pyrrhic victory in a soul-wearying battle with cowardly officials and SJW fanatics that may drag on for months or years, ruining their health and relationships. Kenneth Westhues found in his research that mobbing victims often experience cardiovascular diseases like hypertension, heart attack, or stroke, while marital breakdown and isolation are also common. Women are certainly not immune to mob attack, especially women with incorrect views on trans issues, but most of the fired or publicly pilloried have been men, probably because it is far easier for a male dissident to be framed as a threat. In the case of Professor Negy, it's likely that certain administrators and/or colleagues working behind the scenes had been preparing his ousting for some time. In 2019, he had published a prescient book, as it turned out, with the title White Shaming, Bullying Based on Prejudice, Virtue Signaling, and Ignorance, and it would certainly have made him a marked man on campus. The book argued that white Americans are experiencing an unprecedented attack on their rights and personhood. At a time when 60% of Black Americans are middle class or higher, with 35,000 Black millionaires in the U.S., and when Asian Americans earn more annually as a group than all other groups, including whites, it has become acceptable and even profitable in many circles to racially stereotype all whites as privileged oppressors. A new double standard has become structuralized in society, Negy wrote in the first chapter. We must revere and show deference to non-whites, while whites are to be shamed for all the real, exaggerated, or even manufactured transgressions committed by white people historically or currently. Little or no stigma at all attaches to people who berate and racially bully whites, and Negy gives many examples, singling out activist professors as especially culpable. Negy's book was prescient because it perfectly forecast the anti-white mania that would convulse North America during the summer of Black Lives Matter, as every major institution in the country, from universities to law enforcement, from public libraries to political parties, and from art galleries to large corporations, promised to become less white as quickly as possible. In his book, Negy demonstrated how the media hides violent hate crime when the perpetrators are non-white, while flogging it endlessly when it fits an anti-white agenda. And he gave many examples of the remarkable manner in which whites are expected to tolerate and even applaud harsh denunciations of their race as uniquely evil, while they themselves are held to an impossibly pure standard of racially sensitive conduct toward others. I highly recommend the book, which is filled with noteworthy examples of racial double standards and hypercharged political correctness. The book was also prescient, alas, for Negy's own life, as over the autumn and winter he was forced to attempt to defend statements he may or may not have made so long ago in many cases as to be past accurate recall. During this time, he was denied due process, told very little about the substance of the complaints against him until forced to address them under prolonged questioning, and then blamed when he didn't remember or denied specific instances. Negy's experience is also notable for the stunning swiftness with which his fortunes have turned. He had been a respected tenured professor of 22 years, consistently receiving very high performance ratings. For the past 4 years, in fact, he was evaluated as outstanding. Then suddenly it was as if none of that had ever been. For all professors who find themselves in the mob's crosshairs, the experience is deeply unpleasant, in some cases actually fatal. In his study of circumstances surrounding suicides in Sweden, psychologist Heinz Lehmann estimated that, quote, about 12% of people who take their own lives had recently been mobbed at work. This was the case for Professor Mike Adams, a tenured criminology prof at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, who died by his own hand in late July of 2020 after a mob pile-on. Adams had been hated for years for his outspoken opposition to social justice ideology in academia. He found himself under attack once again after he tweeted against COVID restrictions last spring, addressing North Carolina Governor Roy Cooper in the manner of a slave addressing a slave owner, ironically pleading with him, "Massa Cooper, let my people go." Naturally, this parody was denounced as racist for its appropriation of Black experience. According to reports by those who knew him, Adams then endured a sustained barrage of hate-filled and threatening phone calls, emails, and tweets with no support whatsoever from his university, which was keen to do the mob's bidding. Just weeks before Adams was set to take the early retirement he had negotiated under pressure with his employer, he was found dead in his home. Many on Twitter expressed their delighted satisfaction with this outcome, with one smug SJW hoping that his family, quote, buried his bitch ass in a mask, end quote. The willingness to eliminate nonconformists with extreme prejudice has never been more fervid and unashamed than in our era, when swift retribution follows even the most minor of politically incorrect statements. Let me offer just a few examples. At the University of North Texas, Professor of Mathematics Nathaniel Heers was fired in late 2019 for the simple act of writing on a chalkboard in the faculty lounge, "Please don't leave garbage lying around," with an arrow pointing to a stack of flyers about microaggressions. He was later told by his department head that what he had written was threatening and incompatible with the values of the math department, and his teaching contract was not renewed when he refused to apologize. At the University of Louisville, Professor of Child Psychiatry and Psychology Dr. Alan Josephson was first demoted and then effectively fired, his contract not renewed, merely for participating in a panel discussion on gender dysphoria at the Heritage Foundation, where he expressed his view that the vast majority of children with gender dysphoria eventually reconcile to their biological sex and should be treated for the underlying psychological issues creating their distress rather than be rushed into radical life-altering interventions. His medically sane and compassionate departure from the consensus on trans affirmation spelled the end of his career at Louisville. At the University of California in Los Angeles, Professor of Management Gordon Klein was put on leave and publicly denounced by his dean after he responded to a student email with just a touch of sarcasm. The student had written him following the death of George Floyd, requesting or demanding that he give Black students special accommodations for a scheduled exam. Klein responded by querying the student how he was to know in an online course which students were Black and whether he was to offer half accommodation for mixed-race students, and so on, in a series of half-ironic questions. 20,000 people signed a petition to have him fired for his alleged abuse of power. Though he wasn't in the end fired, he has never received an apology for his very public humiliation. Each of these stories, and many more, all of which deserve a fuller telling, illuminate the depth of self-righteous rage and the determination to destroy unleashed against the non-conforming in our day. Kenneth Westhues has concluded that mobbing is a form of savagery, with roots deep in the primitive human psyche. It is not only a way of excluding the non-cooperative, but also of achieving, at least temporarily, unity in the group by gathering the dark energies of the collective and focusing them outward. These dark energies aren't easily curtailed, and when given institutional encouragement in the name of anti-racism or protection of women, for example, they become monstrous. Unfortunately, recent evidence suggests that younger academics are more rather than less supportive of the practice of canceling. A survey last month by the Center for the Study of Partisanship and Ideology found that, quote, with other factors held constant, a 30-year-old far-left academic has a 50% chance of endorsing at least one of 4 hypothetical dismissal campaigns involving politically incorrect research findings, whereas a 70-year-old far leftist has only a 35% chance of doing so, end quote. The survey's author went on to report that PhD students are 10 to 20 points more in favor of canceling than staff. And unless these trends are capturing a life cycle effect that people mature out of over time, the study portends, quote, rising support for illiberalism, end quote. And it's fascinating to note the kind of politically incorrect research findings leftist academics were willing to cancel. The survey found that, quote, among American doctoral students, 43% would endorse a campaign to dismiss a hypothetical scholar who found that racial and gender diversity reduces the effectiveness of an organization, end quote. That is, in my opinion, a remarkably low bar for alleged harm. The study's author, Eric Kaufman, thus casts serious doubt on the somewhat comforting notion that there's a silent majority in academia who oppose canceling. On the contrary, he argues, there's quite strong support. And even if there is a silent majority on some campuses, very few are willing or feel able to stand up to the mob's annihilating energy. The fear, intimidation, and hatred ripple out in ever-widening circles. Charles Negy introduced his excellent book on white shaming with a reflection on the profound strangeness of our present moment as the alleged pursuit of equality and inclusion has authorized race and gender-based persecution campaigns and remarkable group savagery. Quote, it seems that the arc of justice sometimes takes a detour, he stated, rephrasing Martin Luther King's claim about the arc of the moral universe bending toward justice. Let us hope that what we are experiencing is really a detour only, rather than what I sometimes fear it is, a dead end from which there is no exit and no return.